Welcome, U.S. history students. We are back to our study of the Civil War. We're on section 3 in your book. That starts on page 522. And we're going to talk about the war in the West. Now, we're not talking about like all the way to the West. Not talking about California West, but west of where most of the people in the U.S. lived at the time. The first thing we want to talk about when we talk about this part of the war is we need to talk about Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant. Lincoln was sick to death of General McClellan's hemming and hawing and his hesitation. He didn't have that trouble with Ulysses S. Grant. Now, a couple of interesting things about Grant is his first name was actually Hiram, but when he enrolled in the military academy, and I forget which one he went to, I have to go back and look that up again, they misunderstood. They thought Ulysses was his first name, and that Simpson, which was his mother's maiden name, was actually his middle name. So they put him down as Ulysses S. Grant. He insisted for the rest of his life that the S didn't stand for anything, because it didn't. But we're going to learn about a nickname that he was given that gave something for that S to stand for. So let's talk about that. Our book describes Ulysses Grant as bold and restless. If you were to watch the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, you would hear them say that Ulysses S. Grant was a failure at everything except marriage and war, which is kind of an interesting statement. But he was a good general and by all accounts a good husband, and I guess, you know, what more could you ask for? I don't know. He was not someone who enjoyed being on the defensive. He wanted to do the attacking. He became the commander of the forces in the Union's Western campaign. Remember, the Union is the North, the Confederacy is the South. Ulysses S. Grant is fighting for the Union, and he got his wish. And here is what happened. If you remember the original Anaconda Plan, part of the original Anaconda Plan was to take control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in half to keep the two sides from communicating with each other. It would also cut off the Confederacy in the East from the food production that took place in Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas. So the Union Army could also, if they had bases in on the Mississippi River, they could use that as a launch point to attack communication networks and transportation networks. So, February of 1862, General Grant leads his assault force into Tennessee. Now, I want you to look on the map on page 523 in your textbook, and you will see some arrows. The blue arrows are Union forces. The red arrows are Confederate forces. Okay? So keep that in mind as you look at that map and as we go over some battles in this chapter. Okay, so he moves into Tennessee. He's got Navy gunboats, and the Army of Tennessee took 2 outposts in a couple of key places on some rivers that are important rivers in the West. The first was Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, and that was February 6th of 1862. And a few days later, he took Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. These are both big rivers, important for transportation and communication. Here's the fun story that I was going to tell you, is that when they were in the process of taking Fort Donelson, the commander of Fort Donelson asked for terms of surrender from Grant. And what Grant said back to him, and this is a direct quote, is, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." And Fort Donelson surrendered, and the North as a whole gave a new nickname to Grant's initials. So instead of Ulysses Simpson Grant, they said it stood for Unconditional Surrender Grant. And that was kind of his modus operandi for a lot of the war. So he continues through Tennessee, he's advancing south, and he paused near a place called Shiloh Church. And what he was doing there was he was waiting for the Army of the Ohio. So Grant has the Army of the Tennessee. He's near Shiloh Church. He's waiting for an arrival from the Army of the Ohio. There was a Confederate general named A.S. Johnston who was actually quite close down in Corinth, Mississippi, but he didn't expect an attack from Johnson. So he didn't set up any defenses. He worked on drilling. And that was a mistake on his part. April 6th, 1862. Confederate forces, surprise attack, very early in the morning on Grant's camp. And of course they were still asleep. This attack began the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh was important, and that is this question at the end of your note page. Here's why. This was the battle in which the U.S. Army gained significant control of the Mississippi River Valley. Okay, so this is beginning to make some positive progress for the Union forces. This was a 2-day battle, and it was like battles tend to be, very bloody. General Johnston was killed on the first day of battle. The Ohio forces arrived and helped Grant get back some territory and push the enemy all the way back into Mississippi. The armies both kind of gave out. Each had about 10,000 casualties. And remember, casualty means dead, wounded, or missing. Okay, so around 10,000 casualties for each side. So 20,000 casualties for a single 2-day battle. Both of the sides claimed victory, but in reality the victory was General Grant because of the ground, the territory that he gained. Now, General Grant is basically fighting his way down the Mississippi River. I want you to look at that map again, and you will see a blue arrow that sort of follows the line of the Mississippi River. Okay, that's General Grant's forces. Now, as he's blasting his way down the Mississippi, the Union Navy is trying to blast their way upriver to meet him. How are they going to do that? They've got one big obstacle in their way. Well, they've got several big obstacles, but the first is the port of New Orleans. Now, New Orleans was an incredibly important port. Remember that the South didn't have as much industry as the North. They didn't produce their own stuff. They had lots of food, but they didn't make their own stuff. Cloth. You know, you would think growing all that cotton, hey, we should have some textile mills down here. No, they didn't. And so they had to export their cotton and import other things. And so the port of New Orleans was exceedingly important. New Orleans was also the largest city in the Confederacy at that time, and it was, still is, the gateway to the Mississippi River. You don't get to the Mississippi River without getting through New Orleans. So, let's talk about Admiral David Farragut. Admiral David Farragut. This man is really fascinating. I'm really hoping that one of you will choose him for your mini research project because he's a lot of fun to research. He had 18 ships and around 700 men. So that's a lot of ships, not a lot of guys, not a lot of men. But he comes up with his ships to the 2 forts that guard the entrance to New Orleans. Okay, so you're in the Gulf of Mexico, you're trying to go up into the river, and there are these 2 forts on either side of the river. He can't destroy the forts. He knows that. What's he going to do? He decides to race past them. This is a very risky operation, and you don't get to be where you are, where Admiral Farragut was without being a risk taker. But he planned it out really well. A couple of things he did. So first of all, we're going to do it at night. Right? He's going to get past these forts during the middle of the night. He also had his ships because he had wooden ships. He had these wooden ships basically wrapped in heavy metal chains to protect them in the same way the ironclads were protected. So basically like armor. Another thing that the sailors did was they took mud from the Mississippi River and slapped it all over the hulls of the ship to make the ship hard to see, sort of a camouflage. He tied trees. So they cut down big trees and tied those trees to the masts of these ships to make the ships look like the shore. Basically, they engaged in this huge camouflage operation. So we're going to be at night. We're camouflaging our ships. Okay, April 24th, 1862. It's before dawn, in the very early morning, or very late night, depending on how you look at it. And this is where they made their dash. Okay? Confederates realized what was happening, began firing on the ships from the shore and from gunboats. They actually launched ships, burning rafts. They would build these rafts out of wood, set them on fire, and then push them toward the ships to try and set the ships on fire. Farragut's ship was actually scorched by one of these rafts, which I think is interesting, but his fleet was able to get between those two forts and make it to New Orleans, and the city of New Orleans fell on April 29th. How did the Union take New Orleans? Well, there you go. Admiral Farragut continues to sail up the Mississippi River. He took Baton Rouge. He took Natchez. So Baton Rouge is a city in Louisiana. Natchez is a city in Mississippi, both on the river. And then he gets to the city of Vicksburg. We'll talk about that in a second. The mayor of New Orleans was a man named John T. Monroe. And just so you have like a primary source idea of kind of what the city of New Orleans' reaction was to this. The mayor said, "We yield to physical force alone and maintain allegiance to the Confederate States. Beyond this, a due respect for our dignity, our rights, and the flag of our country does not, I think, permit us to go." So he was not happy about it, but he was going to stay in New Orleans. All right, the Siege of Vicksburg. So we're on 524 in your book, but please remember to flip back to that map on 523 if you want to see where the armies are going and what they're doing. So, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Its location, its geography, made invasion, really difficult, if not nigh on impossible. The city of Vicksburg was set on cliffs that were 200 feet high above the Mississippi River. So because of that, the city of Vicksburg could fire down on any ships that were sailing past, or on any soldiers that were trying to scale those cliffs. Take the high ground, right? That's what they always say. There were also gorges around the city, natural land gorges. So the land geography of Vicksburg made it really difficult to attack. Farragut ordered Vicksburg to surrender, and the commander of Vicksburg says, "Mississippians don't know how and refuse to learn how to surrender. If Commodore Farragut can teach them, let him come and try." It's pretty bold words, right? Well, we don't know how to surrender. Why don't you come teach us, right? Okay, well, let's go. Farragut's guns couldn't reach the city. It was up to General Grant. General Grant's solution was to starve the city into submission. Now, we've talked about what a siege is before, and this was, in fact, a siege. The Siege of Vicksburg began in the middle of May in 1863. They cut off the city and repeatedly shelled it, which means it was the cannon fire, right, into the city. Food ran out. People inside the city and soldiers began eating their horses, their dogs, and rats. One woman wrote I'm not sure if this is in a diary or to another person in a letter. We are utterly cut off from the world, surrounded by a circle of fire. People do nothing but eat what they can get, sleep when they can, and dodge the shells. The Confederate soldiers were sick and they were hungry. General Grant and Admiral Farragut were not letting anyone in or out of that city. There was a group of soldiers who sent a warning to their commander in June of 1863 that said, "The army is now ripe for mutiny unless it can be fed. If you can't feed us, you'd better surrender us, horrible as the idea is." And that was a letter from the soldiers to the Confederate General John C. Pemberton, written in 1863. So you can see how bad this was. This was a really bad conditions for the people of Vicksburg. So on July 4th, General Pemberton did surrender. And one of the things, and I think that this is really important because this shows sort of the kind of man that Ulysses S. Grant was, because he was a guy that was willing to make sacrifices. He was willing to incur casualties. He was willing to take risks. But in the end, he did what was right as well. And one of the things I think is really cool is that as soon as Pemberton surrendered the city of Vicksburg, Grant immediately sent in food to the city, which I think is, like I said, it shows the kind of character of Grant. Grant later on would claim, and this is again a direct quote, that the fate of the Confederacy was sealed when Vicksburg fell. Maybe it was. We've got a while yet to go. Now, early in the war, the Union stopped some attempts by Confederate armies to control lands west of the Mississippi. These are just some interesting battles. You might read more about them in other places. August of 1861, there was a Union detachment from Colorado that turned back a Confederate force at Glorieta Pass. They also defeated rebel forces at Pichaco Pass in Arizona. Confederate attempts to take the border state of Missouri collapsed. They tried to seize the federal arsenal that was in St. Louis in 1861. In 1862, they attacked again with 800 Cherokees. The Cherokees were hoping that the Confederates would give them greater freedom, and slavery was legal in Indian Territory, and some Native Americans who were slaveholders supported the Confederacy. They were outnumbered, but Union forces won that battle, and their defense of Missouri held. Pro-Confederate forces were active throughout the region of the West during the war. They attacked Union forts, raided towns in Missouri and Kansas, and forced the Union commanders to keep troops stationed in that area, which meant the troops weren't other places fighting other battles. And I want to just take a look at the Siege of Vicksburg on 526 and 527. There's a map, and you can see a little bit better of the geography, and you can see how this happens. So you've got, in order, you've got number 1, Grant crosses into Louisiana. Number 2, Grant moves east. 3, Fort Gibson. 4, the Battle of Jackson. And 5, the Siege of Vicksburg. So how does he get there? What does he do? And it'll be a really interesting thing for you to look at to get a little more idea of the geography of the place. President Lincoln actually said, "The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." He was talking about Vicksburg being the key. Vicksburg was so important because of its location, right? Any real estate agent will tell you what's important: location, location, location. Vicksburg had a really key location on the Mississippi River, and capturing Vicksburg would give them control of the Mississippi, and that is what they did. The Battle of Shiloh and the Battle of Vicksburg also really brought Ulysses S. Grant to the forefront of the war, and he becomes even more important to the Union Army. Tomorrow, We're going to take a step back a little bit from the battles, and we're going to talk about what life was like for civilians and for soldiers during the war. So we'll see you tomorrow.